We're really very pleased to have Bob Seeley with us today to talk about his new book, The New Total War, about Russia's war in Ukraine. Uh, I have not yet read all of it, but I have read a very substantial chunk of it.
Thank you.
And, you know, those of you who may have looked him up or read our brief bio in the invitation, they probably saw that Bob has really a very fascinating background as someone who has been a journalist, has been a soldier in Iraq and Afghanistan, has been a member of parliament, also in the United Kingdom. And if you read the book, what I found really impressive about it is that it combines this kind of very engaging journalistic, ground level account of what is going on in Ukraine with sort of a much higher level, very analytical perspective, drawing on kind of an impressive academic background, actually, also, which I failed to mention in listing the other three, but an academic background, uh, and also kind of the perspective of a soldier and the perspective of a politician and policymaker. So it's really integrating all of these points of view, and it's a book that has definitely a very strong perspective, but at the same time, I think is written in a very sort of thoughtful and nuanced manner, which I regret to say is very rarely the case for other works that have strong perspectives.
Thank you
No,
very much.
so that's something that I also really have appreciated about the book in reading it so far. So we're very pleased to have Bob here this afternoon. I will ask Bob as soon as I finish here to talk for maybe 5, 6, 7 minutes just to kickstart the conversation. We will then open up for general discussion. It is an on the record discussion for anyone who cares about those sorts of things. Um, and I'm sure that it will be very rich and engaging. So, Bob, please.
Paul, thank you very much indeed. Can everyone hear me okay? I don't need to speak up or anything. Thank you so much indeed. It's very nice to be here. I am just going to run through the ideas in the book. They're all contained in chapter 1 because I want to try to make it as grabby as possible for international relations students, for soldiers at West Point, at Sandhurst, and as well as for the academic community. So the book is, well, the core ideas are very succinctly put in the first chapter. And as Paul's saying, I try to do two things in the book. I tell the story of Ukrainians and their experience in this war, which has an immediacy, which is clearly going to be very different in 5 years' time. But I also try to tell the story of an idea of warfare, which I think is important and valuable for not only understanding Russian warfare, but warfare this century. Because of Russia's creativity in its evolution and its thinking about warfare and what it consists of, I believe that what the Russians and what Putin has come up with is a template for future war for this century, as practiced by China, as practiced by Iran, as practiced by authoritarian states, and which will be practiced against open and free societies like yours, like ours, in the UK and Europe as well. So, briefly put, the arguments I outline is that in the new total war, Russia has combined all the tools of state power in an idea of permanent conflict, unifying military and non-military tools. Um, and I literally just quote the lead characteristic of what the Russians believe is current or contemporary military conflict and the first characteristic in Russian military doctrine, and that is the integration of military and non-military tools. The non-military tools that it says in the doctrine are economic, political, informational, then says and other measures. So there's a whole panoply of what that might mean, as well as the manipulation of public protest. For military historians and for those of you who've studied the Soviet Union, for me, an attractive way of putting it is to say that this is the integration of two ways of war from the 20th century, one of which we in the West do not recognize as a way of war, but we should have done so. So the first way of war is, the War of the Red Army, the war that we all understand as being what war is, tanks and planes and people in uniform. And, the Soviets did very creative work in the 20s and 30s with the concept of deep battle, operational art, how to combine in a harmonious and fluid way all the elements of the armed force to break through your enemy and to keep going, effectively solving the problems that they had against the Austro-Hungarians in World War I. There was a second way of war as well, which we've never really recognized as a way of war, certainly a way of conflict. And that was the revolutionary, subversive political conflict, the conflict of spies and blackmail, assassinations, propaganda and disinformation. It's known as, the ideological struggle, or active, some people have called it active measures. And it has a body of doctrine, it has a history, it has a tradition, and it now has a century of practice. So for me, whatever we call it, the ideological struggle, active measures, this was a way of conflict in its own right. And what Putin has done in his new total war is to unite those two. So effectively, are there any native Russian speakers here? No? Okay. Because I can't roll my R's. I'm like Lenin. So I have a difficulty with one of the words. So what Putin has done is unite war, vaina, with the ideological struggle, the struggle, baba. And in Russian theory of war, there are people who say that war has to still be seen as in the narrow definition, and everything outside that narrow definition of war, that encapsulates baba. And so that is what Putin has done. And he's done this within military doctrine. Next point, it's new enough to be new. I'm not saying this is absolutely brand new. And a little bit of me, 2%, is saying it's new because it's a good title for the book. However, it is also very true, in my opinion, that it has new elements and we have to think about it in new ways. This is not just a facsimility of past. The integration is greater than before. It sits within military doctrine. There's more focus on the human mind as the ultimate battlefield. It's much more ideologically flexible than the Soviets ever were, drawing on the left and the right, and unscrupulous commercial structures as well, and cyber as well. Which has absolutely changed the rules of the game, although arguably you're still doing the same thing, stealing, finding out stuff, spying, but you're doing so online in a virtual world that simply didn't exist 30, 40 years ago. So this is new enough to be actually significantly new. I think Russian creativity is much newer when they're approaching this because this is an invigorated form of warfare they're dealing with. But also, if we just say it's Soviet 2.0, I think that is a lazy response from us. And so for people in the West who are understanding this, we have to come up with a new way of dealing with it. And that means that we have to see it as being new, as well as it actually being pretty new. I'm very well aware of time, so I'm going to rattle through the next 3 or 4 points. By focusing on Russian doctrine, I make the argument in the book, which I believe clearly is the right argument, that this war did not begin in 2022, did not begin in 2014. Actually, this war began in 2005. And the first stage of the war from 2005, after the Orange Revolution, to 2013-14, was primarily using non-military tools. Excuse me, I do apologize. Was fundamentally using non-military tools. You then had the initial first invasion, so, pretending there were proxies and it was a civil war, absolute nonsense. You then had the initial invasion from 2014 all the way through to 22. That was stage 2. And then you had stage 3, the full-scale invasion from 22 onwards. Stage 4 might be the escalation to nuclear. It may be the de-escalation to political, economic, and informational, again, depending what happens in the next year and negotiations, etc. Or this phase could simply continue. What other points can we say about this? Information warfare is absolutely critical, but it is not, to use a military term, the center of gravity. If you have to say what is at the heart of this form of conflict, it is the integration to become greater than the sum of its parts. So one of the things that Russian war seeks to do is to create synergy, using all these things in a very powerful, either shaping operation or simply as a non-military form of conflict in its own right. It's doing this because Putin wants to be a superpower. He wants his country to be a superpower, but he has the economic resources of Holland or Spain, and therefore he needs to think much, much more creatively about warfare in a way that especially the United States, but also NATO more generally, have not had to do. And that is partly why they still align their ways, means, and ends, arguably more successfully than some of the campaigns that we in the West have fought more recently, when we have relied on physical strength to effectively solve political problems in conflict, like Afghanistan and like Iraq. Um, can I make one more point? Have I got
Sure,
time?
please. No, absolutely.
Russia's new war helps to control Russians. We know that a nation at war tends to rally behind the flag, behind the leader. This is natural. But if you're creating a sense of permanent struggle, which is partly a throwback to the Soviet Union, you are creating conditions of conflict. You make it easier to control people, easier to arrest people, easier to kill people. And so in Putin's last decade in power, he's trying to do three things. He's trying to recreate Russia as a virulently illiberal, anti-Western country. And that he succeeded. And every day that this war continues, it gives him time to reinforce that message. Yes, there are problems on the horizon for him, but war has been a great enabler of the new dictatorship that we're seeing in Russia. Secondly, he wants obviously to destroy Ukraine. And although he hasn't succeeded, he has not yet failed. Thirdly, he will try to destroy NATO Article 5 to render NATO finished as an organization. And that is a battle yet to come. And finally, excuse me, as I mentioned at the beginning, because of Russian creativity about warfare, I argue that, excuse me, I argue that this form of war is a template for how authoritarian states are going to challenge open societies and free societies in this century, certainly for the next 20 to 30 years. That's it in a nutshell. Thank you so much, indeed, Paul.
Oh, thank you, Bob. So let's open it up for questions, and just raise your hands. I would ask as you ask a question or make a comment. Please identify yourself. Uh,
Michael Davis. I read your book, and I think I understand or have taken on board the objective of your narrative, and I appreciate your um, discussion of the ongoing evolution of Russian military doctrine. However, on page 27, you cite that in 2025, the cumulative Ukrainian deaths in battle are 45,000. Then twice you cite that Russian KIA could be as high as 900,000. I don't want to take issue with that because that kind of litigation is not helpful. But wouldn't it have served your narrative objectives better to have reversed that? In other words, if Ukraine has gotten this far and only suffered 45,000 dead, while the Russians have been bleeding out, literally, that undercuts, it would seem to me, the argument that Russia will continue to pose a threat to the rest of Europe. Had Russia lost that many, well, I mean, they'd be a basket case right now. Now, they have lost a lot, and the Media Zona puts it as of November at 145,000. And I won't go into the Ukrainian thing because it's 2 orders of magnitude higher than what you cite. It would seem to me that if it had been a really if Ukraine had really suffered as it has, that would make a very strong argument for the kind of calls you see in Europe, in the UK and Germany, elsewhere, for really vigorous rearmament and girding one's loins for the long twilight struggle with Russia. So I just wondered what your thoughts were on why you used the figures you did.
Okay, Michael, firstly, thank you very much indeed for reading the book so carefully. If I was trying to quip, I'd say you probably read it more carefully than my editor, which slightly frustrated me at the time. But that wouldn't be quite true.
Compliment. It was extremely easy and fast reading.
Thank you very much. Well, that's very kind of you. Thank you. Right. I think I'm going to try to answer your points, and feel free to interrupt if I'm not doing so. Yeah, I saw the figure of 45,000 and I quoted it. And in the back of my mind, I was thinking, is that a little bit too low? Are the Ukrainians holding back? And if you look at the injured figures, they are 300,000 plus. So, and those figures are slightly out for predictable casualties in war, which tend to be 3-to-1 injured to killed in action. So the 50,000 dead, on top of that, there are several tens of thousands of civilian dead, maybe between 20 and 30,000 civilian dead. And on top of that, you're dealing with low hundreds of thousands of injured. So the human cost has been quite high, whether it's 60,000 dead, 40,000 dead, plus tens of thousands of injured. The problem that Ukraine has fundamentally is that Russia has, without wishing to be too pejorative, a sort of quasi-slave army. I'm not sure one can argue about whether that's a particularly accurate term.
Volunteers, so that's a hell of a kind of slave.
You're right there, but it's also, okay, when they're in the army, the meat assaults are a form of human wave. And that is a very, and I think there is a sense of people getting into the armed force without necessarily realizing what they have signed up to, and then finding that they are killed if they don't go forwards, if they're imprisoned, they're raped, they're subject to significant forms of torture. So you're right, it is arguably the first major army in Russian history that has not been a conscript army, although there was an initial round of conscription in September of the first year. So, but I think once you're in there, you are treated as cannon fodder in a way that I think is very difficult for us to imagine this century. But let me just answer your point. Putin is happy with a very high ratio of dead to injured as long as he can inflict lasting pain on Ukraine. Now, you can argue with a killed in action ratio of something approaching 1-9 and 1-10 that Putin is failing to do that and will eventually run out of men. But it's not so much how much the Russians are sacrificing, it is what potentially they will gain. It's the damage that they can potentially do to Ukraine on the way. So just because Ukraine is losing land relatively slowly and losing troops at a much slower rate to the Russians, I'm not sure that is necessarily an argument to say, we don't need to rearm, we think that things are going pretty well, because the Russians may yet force a humiliating and degrading peace on Kiev, or may, in the next coming months and years, by force of action, still actually emerge triumphant, simply because Ukraine has a very, very significant manpower shortage. They've moved from manning a front line to having a form of zonal defense because of the saturation of drones, which is now dominating the battlefield. So Ukraine still, despite having much lower casualties, has a significant recruitment and morale crisis.
Ratio of Russians to Ukrainians on the battle line is 1-6 now, and it certainly wasn't in the beginning. Ukraine had a huge army, and that army is evaporating. Now, granted, there are increasingly dire numbers that I get from Ukrainian officials about desertions, but the incredible meteoric rise in desertions in the last several months is due to an army that is, like many armies in that situation, on the verge of coming apart. But the losses that preceded that, especially in the major offensives, in Kherson, in Kharkov, in Kursk, and the failed Zaporizhian counteroffensive, the enormous numbers of men that were funneled into Bakhmut. These have to be reckoned with, and all I'm saying is, because I don't want to argue what the numbers are, it's much more. It makes your narrative much more urgent if, in fact, Ukraine could collapse And Russia, not having suffered as much as you say it has, would then be relatively not eager, but willing to continue to push on, and threaten NATO directly. My concern with the 900,000 figure and then the counterpoint 45,000 is an exhausted Russia is not going to be a threat to Europe.
I'm not sure it will be exhausted, and I'm not sure, and there is no evidence, and evidence may emerge quite soon, but it certainly hasn't yet, that the loss of manpower and indeed the loss of equipment is halting Russia's ability to man its armed forces. And when one is talking about challenging NATO, I don't think you're talking about challenging it in a significant conventional sense. I think you are talking about a smaller scale incursion manipulated using paramilitaries and political tools and instruments, which challenges Article 5 and causes a political crisis, not necessarily a military crisis. That is the argument which has been put forward by some academics in Europe, in Eastern Europe, and it's an argument that in part I buy, because it's a question of how you react and how you react politically. There is a military element. If in 2 years' time you have got 10,000 drones coming over to NATO battalions in the Baltic republics, and you've got these 10,000 drones, if you don't have an answer to that, you're in a world of pain. So it might be that even quite a weak Russian army, by conventional standards, can do significant damage in the Baltic republics if it is carefully handled and presented, and the politics and the informational warfare around it are skillfully manipulated by Putin. And he's shown an ability to do that.
Denial of service. Yeah. Attack.
Yeah.
We have I think a couple of other questions
sorry.
here. I would
Thank you.
I'll just personally sort of make one observation that I think, at least to me, is an important one about this war. Setting aside how many people have or haven't been killed or wounded on both sides, and we have sort of primarily the two governments to rely on, and each one of them has its own sort of motives for how it reports data. But setting aside that whole question, there's a separate question of sort of how those two governments manage the flow of information and how they control the narratives about the war inside their own societies. And the reason that I raise that is that inside Russia, actually inside both countries, and I'm sorry to go on at length here, but I think inside both countries, the governments portray this war as an existential war. And Russia, for its reasons, Ukraine, I think, for somewhat more obvious reasons than Russia. But each government portrays it as an existential war. In the Russian case, you have a government that is kind of clamping down on reports of casualties and threatening families of soldiers who were killed, and doing all kinds of other things to limit how that information spreads through the society. And I think in the Ukrainian case, that is much less true. And I think there's also kind of a different dynamic that's at play. But let's sort of move on, because I want to make sure that everybody has an opportunity who wants to. And again, please identify yourself. Jeff. Yes.
My name is Jeff Burt. I'm a retired attorney. I had an office in Moscow for 15 years in the late 80s and 90s. The narrative in February or March of 2022 was that Putin made a tragic miscalculation, that he relied on his intelligence community, that in his mind it'd be over in a week, 2 weeks maximum. Do you disagree with those accounts that Putin was surprised and that he was misled? And if that's the case, then perhaps the what you've just outlined, the various stages, uh, are victims of of an accident. We've just fallen into this, and Putin's fallen into this. And was not part of some grand strategy. He thought the opportunity was ripe to grab Ukraine because he thought the West just wouldn't come to their defense and that Ukrainians were incapable of defending themselves.
Jeff, I think this was part of a long-term strategy, which is that he doesn't recognize Ukrainian independence and he doesn't recognize Ukraine as a country separate from Russia. And he very openly outlined those arguments in his historical essay on the unity of Russians and Ukrainians, which he published the summer before, and it was effectively the intellectual raison d'etre for the invasion. Depending on who you talk to, okay, so one of the theories that I quote, talking to a few people in the SBU and other sort of intelligence agencies, and then a few people outside watching it, is that he wasn't getting his way by the end of 2022. So the FSB had been instructed to do effectively a version of 2014 all over again. So they were channeling money to people to set up martial arts clubs, to get their sort of heavies ready. And people around Zelensky in the pay of the Russians were trying to persuade Zelensky to give up on NATO and EU membership. Not because that was a goal in itself, although that's a useful byproduct for Putin, but because, I'm so sorry, because that would spark a significant backlash within Ukraine, which would end with lots of violence on the streets, which would be manipulated by Russian agent provocateurs on both sides, who would then take their weapons, start killing people on both sides. So you would then have the perception of societal breakdown or political breakdown within Kiev, which would then give the Russians an excuse to move in as peacekeepers. You may think this is an absolutely nonsense idea, but that is what the SBU or parts of the SBU believe that was going to happen. Putin short-circuited the FSB's medium-term, short to medium-term plans by saying, I want this to happen now, and made the decision. I think the British military attaché there said that the final decision was made about a week before, and most of the soldiers only knew 24 hours before, so it was very close hold. What that meant from a military point of view is that, and the reason why the Ukrainians and indeed other soldiers, Europeans, they looked at Russian doctrine and they looked at what you needed to move an army. 150 kilos per day supplies for soldiers, including fuel, including weapons, etc. None of, or not enough of those indicators were there to indicate that there would have been an invasion according to Russian doctrine. The other thing that the military didn't do is to do the initial period of war planning, which I think you call in the US phases 0 and phase 0 and phase 1. So effectively, this wasn't a fighting invasion. It was a sort of pile-in lads invasion. There was a military element to it, which is that you were going to fix the 8 Ukrainian brigades in the east of the country. Everywhere else, it's effectively a slightly more war-y version of Czechoslovakia in 68 or Hungary in 56. You'd smother the country, key cities with lots of soldiers, and you would surround and seal Kiev, at which point the GRU and the FSB would go through their assassination list and stage a coup d'etat. So effectively, that became the plan. It was rushed. The FSB's plan was scrapped, and the Russian military did not do their phase 0 and phase 1 planning, which is why when journalists saw all the great queues of traffic of Russian armor, everyone said, oh, the Ukrainians are in trouble. Actually, what they were looking at was a shambolic operation, which the Ukrainians then started to pick off.
Right. Yeah. Jacob, and then. Yes.
I have a burning question.
Yeah.
Page 28. Actually, what I'm curious about is the title of your book, Total War.
Yes.
So that was used by Nazi propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels, his speech in the Berlin Sports Palace. And
Yes,
if you want total war, and then he said, do you want total war? And then the entire place goes into a frenzy. Outstretched arms, and they all scream, yeah, or yes. Now, that's not happening in Russia. Do you think that total war is actually the analogous to what was taking place? Again,
that's a really good question. And the answer is yes, with the proviso, but this is not I do say this in the introductory chapter, this is not total war like the 19th and 20th centuries. It's not mass mobilization with mass industrial production, although there's a lot of that. The total war refers to all of the all the tools of the state being used, not simply manpower, propaganda, and industrial power. So it is a different form of total war, and I'm quite clear about that. I do say, look, it's not 19th century Napoleonic, early Napoleonic. It's not 20th century. It is a new form of total war when the total refers primarily to all the tools that are being used, from the Russian Orthodox Church to disinformation to political warfare to military, to the threat of nuclear war as well. So that's the sense of total, that it involves all the tools of state power. But actually, at the moment, if you look at Russian industrial production, they have a very wartime economy. What is it? What are the latest figures? 30% of GDP is 40% of GDP is going to the military in some form, and probably more in security and other spin-off elements to it. So you are looking at a country that's effectively going back to its Soviet past. So I would say that actually, although the trouble is, if you look at history, you sort of think that everyone was fighting all the time in World War II. But actually, the Germans didn't really practice total war until relatively late in the war. The Brits actually got their economy gearing up to total war more quickly than I think the Germans did, simply, because of the evolution of the war. So now, yes, I think there is there is an element of total war in the traditional sense, but that's not also the sense in which I use the term.
David Abramson, recently of Bureau of Intelligence and Research at the State Department, but I just retired, so there's nothing here on the sheet. I'm sorry, I haven't read your book, but I wanted to, if total war is based on this sort of consolidation, centralization of all of these capabilities, given that, in my assessment, Putin underestimated Ukraine's ability to fight back, underestimated the US and the West's response, and overestimated Russia's military capabilities. What does this say about the future of authoritarian states using this total war based on such high levels of self-deception, or advisors who are unwilling to tell the truth to things that the Putin doesn't want to hear? So how do you deal with that?
Okay. I think two things. Firstly, self-deception is not, sadly, solely the preserve of authoritarian states. You could say that the British miscalculated over the Falklands, which is why there was a war, because they misjudged what was happening. Sadly, the US, I think, were fooled by some of the people that you were talking to over Iraq, for example, in the second Iraq war. So self-deception becomes, it is common in governing systems where there isn't robust challenge, as there actually should have been in yours, because yours is the perfect system, of checks and balances. So, it's a shame that you didn't have, whoever was advising, was it George Bush at the time?
Yeah.
The W. Bush. Clearly, I think there was an element of error there, and also the de-Baathification, also, sadly, an error of judgment. But these things happen to major powers throughout history. I would also say in this case that I, I'm not saying whether they win or lose, but it's the damage they do on the way. I mean, Hitler lost. Great. That doesn't mean to say that the World War II wasn't an economic and moral and human disaster, because tens of millions of people die. So is Putin going to lose? Well, he may, but he may not. And I am less optimistic than some, only because I see this guy continuing to fight, continuing to crush his own society, continuing to cause problems and endlessly test. And if we're looking right now, we can say, he's not really succeeding. In 2 years' time, if Ukraine is forced to accept a humiliating peace, if it halves the size of its army, if there's genuine conflict on the streets, because soldiers come back to say, what have we been fighting for? Putin is playing a very long game here. And you're saying, well, he hasn't won now, therefore he's not going to win. I'm saying he hasn't won yet, and he hasn't lost yet. But actually, arguably, in changing his society, he's already achieved that. I think he's testing significantly our unity, the unity of the transatlantic alliance, And I think there's some suggestions to say that it is fraying at the edges. And I do think he's going to test NATO, not because he's stronger than NATO, although I would just say there's two armies in the world that are understanding drone doctrine, and neither of them are in NATO. One wants to destroy NATO, Russia, actually add to that for China, and one wants to be part of NATO, that's Ukraine. We are a long way behind with our doctrine. So I think there is still danger ahead politically for NATO, but potentially in a limited war, also militarily as well. So yes, he's not winning yet, but it's the damage that dictators do on the way before they lose, or some of them don't lose because they know when to stop.
Uh, Bob, uh, maybe a question for me. I don't see one immediately from the group. Uh, Toward the end of the book, you address, Putin's nuclear threats and kind of will Russia sort of use nuclear weapons or not use nuclear weapons. And as you think about that question, sort of from the perspective of trying to divide the alliance,
Mhm.
from a security perspective, our European NATO allies are afraid that Putin might invade a NATO country,
Yeah.
or potentially even their country,
Yeah.
depending on where they are geographically. I think there are very few Americans who are afraid of a Russian invasion of the United States.
It's not likely.
The fear for the United States, in terms of the trajectory of the conflict, is that it escalates and the United States becomes involved in a nuclear conflict.
Yeah.
So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about nuclear weapons, but also from the perspective of this kind of asymmetry, that exists between the United States and our European allies.
I mean, you're right when you say that Russia isn't going to invade France. It's not going to invade the United States. It's not going to invade Greenland. It ain't going to invade Britain. The issue is how Russia will attempt to intimidate its immediate neighbors, which are, whether we like it or not, members of NATO. Whether we should have taken the Baltic republics into NATO is an interesting question. There are people who would say it is an unnecessary risk because it was part of the Russian Empire. There are ethnic Russian populations there, and we have given ourselves or given the Russians a casus belli potentially with NATO. On the other hand, the one thing that has almost certainly stopped the Russians from kicking off in the Baltic republics is membership of NATO. So NATO is keeping the peace until such time as it fails to do so. When it comes to nuclear weapons have worked at one level that the Biden administration has been much more reluctant to support Ukraine. And indeed, there was a nervousness in Europe as well because of Russian threat of nuclear weapons. So nuclear weapons work primarily, or have currently worked primarily, as tools of information warfare and political warfare. And they've actually been quite successful. So when politicians stand up in Europe or anywhere in the world, say we're not going to give in to nuclear blackmail, that's exactly what's happened, because there's been a slowness to respond because of the Russian threats, including, I remember the first night of the invasion when Putin said, you'll see a response unlike you've never seen before. That absolutely made people nervous. And we were scared to arm the Ukrainians in the months leading up to the invasion, when actually that kit could have made a significant difference. We were scared because we were worried that that would give Russia cause to escalate. So we had given Russia the escalatory privilege even before this war started. Do I think the Russians are going to use nuclear weapons? I think it is extremely unlikely, although I'm sure you've all read the New York Times and other reports saying if there'd been a collapse in Russian lines entirely in 2022, there was a 50-50 chance that nuclear weapons were going to be used. I'm not sure I quite buy the 50-50 analysis, but there was potential. The Russians have much lower threshold of use. The Russians see these as usable weapons, not as the tools of Armageddon. They just see it as another weapon. Okay, it's pretty serious, but it's not unusable. If you look at a military exercise practice, NATO tends to use nuclear weapons right at the end of a military exercise. The Russians tend to use it a third or halfway through. because, you know, they exercise through nuclear weapon use. So they think about it more seriously than we do. I think Putin is very unlikely to use nuclear weapons, but when the Ukrainians say there's no chance, it's all a bluff, it's all a bluff, there is a little bit of me that says, A, you don't know, and B, there is a small chance that he will. Putin always escalates. He escalated in 2005, he escalated in 2013, he escalated in 2022. The question is, would he escalate to nuclear weapons? It is unlikely. I would not rule it out. And there has, as I'm sure that experts here have read, in by any missile and other publications, there have been occasional, not very often, but occasional references to the theory of escalate to de-escalate, although it's not necessarily part of Russian doctrine publicly anyway. It's certainly been speculated on, and the head of the nuclear forces has at times also talked about escalation to de-escalate. So I wouldn't entirely rule it out, although it is unlikely.
No, thank you. Thank you. We have one here and then one there.
Yeah, I'm Sir Schneeman from the New York Times. Very interesting concept. I look forward to reading the book, but I was wondering if you could speak a bit more about how this began, this new doctrine, and how it evolved. You dated 2005. Uh, was this something that was in Putin's mind and everybody else's in his group from the outset? Was this some search for greatness that began with the collapse of the Soviet Union? Or was this something that evolved as he grew more humiliated and more resentful?
And stronger.
Strong.
I mean, I think it probably was the more resentful aspect, although it's actually one of my favorite bits that was writing about this, because one of his advisors at the time, God, sorry, his name has temporarily left my mind. He's half Chechen, who came up with the idea of managed democracy.
Vladislav Surkov.
Surkov, sorry, yeah. I mean, Surkov was very interesting. I mean, he's an interesting guy, and he was asked about what Russian culture was, and Surkov said it was a contemplation of the whole. And I love his quote, because you could argue that, and Isaiah Berlin, I'm sorry, I'm going to go in a little bit of a red herring if you don't want to. Isaiah Berlin also talked about the totalitarian nature of the Russian intellectuals, because there was the search for a unifying single idea that would encompass spiritual and political and emotional life, especially after the failures of Russia in the 19th century and the more it fell behind the West. And so you had this sense of contemplation and search for the whole and search for uniqueness, which I do talk about a little bit in the book. And also the battle between Slavophiles and Westernizers. And there is an element in Russian military doctrine which I root in the search of the Russian intellectual need for searching for an idea of an all-encompassing and unifying concept. And you see that not only in the new total war, but you see it in Putin's repeated references to the unity of the East Slavic people. So there is a search for unity, whether we think it's important or not, but there was a search for unity in a sense of a unifying doctrine for the military and strategic, and there was a search for unity in the sense of the relationship between Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus. That aside, there was also a much more sort of cruder development. There was a need for searching for an enemy. And you go back and you look at people who were influential in the Russian military academy in the first decade of the 2000s. And a guy I quote a lot as being symbolic of that was Makhmut Gareev, who was, I think, Russian chief of staff at the end of the under Yeltsin, and then ran the military academy, and actually I think was responsible for Voyenny Missile, which was the in-house publication of the military academy. And he and other conservatives gave Putin what he wanted to hear, which was the West has always hated us, the West is always a threat, and also the Western threat comes in military and non-military forms. So they really rooted back into that old Soviet era paranoia. And Gareev, he was an interesting figure because he was arguing this. And I think, organized crime, the cynicism and the corruption of the Russian politics at the time, the search for an enemy became very valuable. You saw it immediately that Putin became prime minister. What happened? The apartment bombings, almost certainly engineered by the FSB. Shocking and appalling as that sounds, even now, 20 years on. 600 Russians dead, the FSB blowing up apartment blocks in various locations in Russia, the Second Chechen War immediately afterwards, and Putin seals the presidency. So I think one shouldn't underestimate their debasement. And I think you had a bunch of things happening at the same time. You had the need for an enemy because of the failure of Russia to reform. You had this sense of looking for how to unify power in order to deliver synergy. Because one of the things that Russia does, it's much poorer than it used to be, but the more that you can unite all forms of power at your disposal, be it the Russian Orthodox Church, be it this, be it that, whatever, you create synergy and you become more than the sum of your parts. So either you achieve things just through political war, as they're now trying to do in Georgia, for instance, and succeeding sadly, or political warfare becomes shaping ultimately to military war. So I think this came out of a conservative hostility to the United States and NATO. I think it came out the need for searching for a new identity and a new way of doing business, a new way of combining military and non-military to create synergy and to create a state power. And I think those were the things that were behind it. And I think Putin accepted all this because I think it became politically convenient. But actually, the one final point I would say there, Putin also, because of the KGB, his KGB past, the FSB and the KGB's definition of conflict became the defining element of this new form of war. And if you look at Gerasimov's, I always put the stress in the wrong place, sorry, Gerasimov, if you look at Gerasimov's 2013 article, he effectively says, it was never Gerasimov's doctrine. In 2013, Gerasimov said, we have to accept that if the Arab Spring and non-military conflict are the wars of the future, then we, the army, need to accept that, and we need effectively to be supporting other factors, i.e. the FSB. And so you had also, if you look at the phasing of military operations that Gerasimov introduced in 2013, they were, in my mind, near identical to the KGB phasing of operations, which was developed under active measures: demoralization, destabilization, bringing to crisis, normalization. Gerasimov added two other bits. He split two of those, so he had 6 phases rather than 4, but effectively they were identical. And that's what they ended up with. Did that answer your question?
Yes, and it's Gerasimov.
No, I think it's
Gerasimov.
Gerasimov.
Why does everyone say Gerasimov? I find it very
That's-
frustrating.
Ludovic.
Who the vote State Department apparatus.
Europe. Which European governments, if any, recognize, understand this integrated warfare? And in the future, which of the larger governments, if any, will drag the rest of the continent into the appropriate posture to deal with it?
Philip,
Did you speak English for State Department?
Look, I suppose one of the reasons I wrote this was because I'm not sure that people really understand this form of war. And so I'm trying to explain what I think is an important thing to understand. I think some politicians say we understand it, but what they sort of see is military plus information warfare. They don't understand the phasing. They don't understand the complexity. They don't understand that these are intense shaping operations for military military action, or they may be intense operations in their own right. So I am skeptical about the ability for anyone to understand this. And I don't want to sound too precious about it, because it does sound a bit precious. But no, I don't think we do understand it. And I think we need to. That doesn't mean we need to copy it, because the strength of open and free societies is very different from authoritarian societies. But we need to do much more than we've been doing to understand it and to inoculate ourselves against it, which is not easy, but it can be done. But we're not even trying at the moment. And I think we keep being surprised by our enemies as a result.
We'll take the last question here, and then we'll sort of break and have a glass of wine. Um, uh, just as you were finishing there, you touched on one other thing, and this is a comment, not a question, because I just want to have one question. You touched on one thing that I thought was an interesting and important point in the book. The idea of sort of our confidence in our own societies, and the role that plays in our ability to kind of to deal with Russia. But please.
We good. So yeah, actually, very short comment and
Oh, and sorry, if you could identify yourself.
yeah, absolutely, and short question afterwards. So my name is Arturas Vazdis. I'm a deputy chief of mission of Lithuania.
Hello.
Yeah.
I might be going. I think I'm speaking at the Ground Defence Conference you've got on the 9th and the 10th, and we're talking to your Ministry of Defence about potentially having a drone factory in your country.
Great. It would be, yeah, absolutely. I found really very interesting and thought-provoking your remarks, and that provoked me to read the book, and yeah, even to think about some maybe arranging some presentation here or in Lithuania, but we'll think on that. But okay, but okay, let me start from the short comment. One point you made on yeah, on the escalation.
Yeah.
So the short comment from my side, from our observations, that Putin and current Russian establishment, as many establishments before him, will escalate as much as and as far as we allow him to escalate, and that there are no chances to de-escalate by giving some concessions, by trying to appease him. So that's our one of the major points and understandings of the nature of Kremlin. And well, in addition to that, when you were speaking about the school of thought, which says that maybe if Baltic states were not at NATO, then NATO would be safer. So I if we will think this way, we can go to the point even to Alaska. It also was part of Russian Empire. So yeah, but I don't want to continue this, but just
It's a fair point.
to show the whole picture of that thinking. So, but the question is very simple. Given your last point of the introductory remarks, when you said that the final goal of Putin is to destroy NATO Article 5 and maybe to destroy the organization itself. So, given this, the question is, how to stop Putin?
I think there's a bunch of things that you need to do, and it's difficult because if you're fighting against something which people don't see as being war, it's difficult to say you're at war. We're not at war with Russia, the West, but we are in conflict. And what I wish my country would do is, and Estonia does it. So the Capo, the security forces in in Estonia, they issue an annual report of threats, and I think it's a very important document. Great. The UK needs to do that. The UK needs to, and the US and every country needs to say, what are the threats facing it, be they military and non-military. We will lack the bottle to do it at the moment because we can't even put the Chinese on an enhanced tier of foreign registration. It's absolutely absurd. But we should have a very honest report from MI5, from MI6, from GCHQ, so our security agencies and the listing agencies, maybe overseen by the National Security Committee in Parliament, something that's got a few old school, MPs in it with some credibility, and under a sort of parliamentary format, so that is produced on an annual basis. And then once that information is out in the public domain, it will help the public debate about how we deal with this. There is a second document that we should be producing every year, which is a statement of economic dependency. And again, if Germany had done that in the years leading up to this, maybe more people would have questioned the wisdom of being so absolutely dependent on Russian gas via Nord Stream 1 and Nord Stream 2. Merkel, I thought, was a disaster for Germany and for Europe. Effectively had the argument that the more that Russia ties itself in to the European Union and to Germany, the more leverage that Germany will have over it. Putin simply flipped that on its head and thought, I'm going to invade because I have so much leverage now to switch off the gas going into the European Union. So we need a statement of dependency. In the UK's case, it will find far too much dependency on China. And when we find that and publicly admit it, we can then start weaning ourselves off those supply lines for chips, for raw materials, for rare earths. And, we can rely on Bangladesh a bit more, on India a bit more, on Africa a bit more. We can onshore industry when we actually sort out the absolute stupidity of net zero, which is destroying our jobs and industry. And even even the US ambassador is basically telling us how to do our policy now. I mean, it's incredibly embarrassing. But I'm quite glad he is, actually, because at least he means it in a broadly affectionate way. So without knowledge, there can be no action. So you need action, and you need knowledge, and that will then proceed to action. But even that is difficult because of what our concept of warfare is. That we do not see warfare in the same way that revolutionary societies like Iran, like China, like Russia do. So we need to relearn. We need to understand that, and we need to have, you're right, more confidence in our own, the point that you were making, we need to have more confidence and love for our own civilization and our extraordinary achievements, and actually be much more ready to defend them.
Thank you very much, Bob.
Thank you.
Please join me. Thank you.